All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to introduce Heather Tinsley-Fix from the AARP team, who's going to kick everything off. Heather, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. It's very exciting to see people saying where they're logging in from. We've got folks from Canada, from Germany, and from all over the US. So that's the first for us. I think it's very cool to have you guys on our webinar today. So yes, my name is Heather Tinsley-Fix, and I'm a senior advisor. I work on a number of employer engagement initiatives. So we're always wanting to reach out to the employer community. One of these initiatives is the AARP Employer Pledge, which is a pledge that employers can sign to show their support for an age-diverse workforce and to show that they value older workers as part of that multi-generational mix. We're going to be joined by one of our pledge signers today, CVS. But first, we're going to be talking with Caroline Walsh of Gartner Research, and she's going to cover some really fantastic, interesting research around people's attitudes towards hybrid work, hybrid being remote sometimes and in person sometimes. And then we're also going to be joined by Greg Schmidt of CVS, and he's going to talk about their efforts around equity and social justice, as well as their diverse pipelines, and also cover what it was like for them and what it still continues to be like to have half your workforce remote and half of your workforce as frontline workers. A little bit of housekeeping for the purposes of the presentation that we're going to go through, and until we get to Q&A, it's best to stay on mute. You guys are old hands at this by now. Obviously, we've been doing this for 15, 16 months. But please do submit your questions either in the chat directly or the Q&A button, and we'll get to those questions shortly. So without further ado, I think I will hand it off to, what we're going to learn. Probably, thank you. Thanks, Colin. So we're definitely going to look at hybrid workforces through a multi-generational lens. One of the things I'm most interested in learning from our panelists is how do you address equity when you have a hybrid workforce if some of your workforce is not showing up because they're remote? Does that create sort of two levels of worker? The worker that has the FaceTime and shows up and is there versus the worker who's remote. When we were all remote, everyone was sort of on an equal playing field, but that's changing now. We're going to hear from Caroline about how to redesign your workforce away from an office-centric model, which is of the past, and towards this new model that we're all trying to define. And then we're going to hear examples from Greg about the workforce initiatives they have that support equity and diverse talent pipelines. So now, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Caroline Walsh, Vice President and Team Manager of the HR practice at Gartner. Caroline, I think you're still on mute. Hold on, let's see if I can.
Thank you. There we go.
There you go. Okay,
am I
great.
unmuted now? Okay, great. Thank you.
Great.
It wouldn't be a hybrid work conversation if someone didn't have a challenge coming off of mute. So I'm glad that I could get that out of the way for everyone. It is absolutely lovely to meet you all today. And again, thank you, Heather. It's lovely to see all of these folks joining from all over the world. My name is Caroline Walsh, and I am a Vice President in the HR practice at Gartner. And there I work with heads of HR, heads of talent management in planning for and answering all of the key questions that they have in any given time. As you can imagine, over the last year and a half, the questions have really revolved around what do we do now? It was first, how do we get our teams out of the office? Then it was, how do we engage our teams while they're remote? And now we're focusing on this question of, excuse me, what will the hybrid future be? And we are defining a hybrid future as a future, like what Greg is going to talk about a little bit at CVS, where part of the workforce is in the office and part of the workforce is remote. And there's a whole spectrum of different ways of looking at that. It can be static, you're assigned remote, you're assigned in the office, or it can be with flexibility to flow from one location to the other. So that's what we're going to get into today. And to start out, I should also mention that the research I'm going to share with you today is based off of data that we collected from surveys with heads of HR, as well as surveys of employees across all different industries. But I will note that we have cut the data today to focus on knowledge workers. We did that just for ease of analysis. A lot of the insights, though, are valuable and apply to non-knowledge worker work. So we can talk about that a little bit as well as we go through. Before we dive in, though, I'd like you to take a minute and actually think back to 2019 and think back to what it was like to go into your office. If you were like me, you went into your office and your desk was probably fairly similar to that of your colleagues. I like to think that mine had better kids' artwork on it, but that was just my opinion. Then partway through the day, around 10:30 or so, I'd go to the elevator to go get some coffee. And there I would meet a colleague, happenstance. And we would start talking about our weekends, but also start strategizing, planning, maybe even plan an impromptu brainstorming session that we could have later in the day. When I'd get back to my desk, I might look up and I might see my manager, who could see that I was not at my desk there for a little while, had that line of sight to see what I was doing, and knew that I had gone to get coffee, but also that I was talking with a colleague, so probably making good use of my time. If this sounds familiar, then you can understand that in the world of the before times, we designed our work based on our work environment. So that environment, that office, was central to the way in which we designed how we worked. We thought that consistency was inevitable for driving those equitable experiences. We had to have the same desks, the same opportunities. We thought that serendipity was central to driving innovation, that happenstance elevator conversation. And we thought that managers had to have line of sight to understand what their employees were doing and to help support their performance moving forward. But we all know what happened next. And what we saw is that as most organizations moved the workers that they could out of the office and into the remote setting, organizations lost that consistency, that visibility, and that serendipity. And it's understandable to think that when this first happened, a lot of organizations got really worried. They got really concerned. And so they did what made sense at the time. They began to recreate what they had lost. So for consistency, organizations tried to virtualize tools. How many of you got a new whiteboarding app that you could use to make sure that you were able to share your ideas quickly and easily with your colleagues? Other organizations added more and more mandatory meetings, even mandatory team fun to try and add to that, to try and recreate some of that serendipity. Other organizations added more and more manager check-ins to make up for that loss of visibility. I actually even have spoken with some organizations where, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, they encouraged their employees to leave their cameras on all day on Zoom, just so that they could have that sense of the team all being there together and seeing one another. The problem with this approach is that even though it was done with best of intentions, recreating the office in the remote environment was actually very damaging and added to massive levels of fatigue that were already present in the remote environment. Take a look at this page and take a look at this first blue bar. What we found here is that when we looked at employees in the remote environment, there are high levels of fatigue, exhaustion, burnout that exist just naturally. You probably are overwhelmingly familiar with these already. There are digital distractions. You have screens popping up at you at all times, news alerts. You have virtual overload. You have every kind of way of chatting with your colleagues and coworkers and friends and family, all here at once on your screen. And then always on. We talked to a lot of employees and a lot of organizations and leaders even who felt like they needed to perform to demonstrate that they were always available and that they were working hard, even though they may not be seen. Add these all up, you get high levels of exhaustion and burnout that I know you're all very familiar with already. The problem is that when organizations sought to recreate what they had in the office by adding virtualization, adding meetings, adding tracking and manager check-ins, we saw that that simply added to the fatigue that was already there. So we find ourselves out of the office into the remote world, trying to make up for the new environment, and massive amounts of burnout happening. At the same time, many of us experienced wonderful things in the remote environment. What we found is that averages and looking at the average experience is almost meaningless when we look at the past year and a half, because this crisis has created thrivers who have done very well and divers who have suffered from burnout and loss and all kinds of challenges. So this experience over the past year was inherently unequal. Just for one example of one of the good things, many of the caretakers that we spoke with, 2/3 of them said that the remote experience allowed them to manage that caretaking responsibility more effectively. So when we look at what's next and we look at where we're going to go in the future, we have to wrestle with this problem of how do we mitigate the bad that we found over the past year while maintaining our hold on the good. We don't want to lose what those thrivers gained just by making up for what those divers had to face. In order to look at this problem of what's next, we had to think back to what we started our conversation with, the work environment and the work design. Now, what we found is that in the before times, remember, you had what we see over on the left. You had an office-centric work design that made sense for the in-person environment down here. When we all moved remote, suddenly we were in a new environment. Our environment looked completely different, but we tried to recreate that office-centric work design, again, based on that consistency, serendipity, and visibility. It's a little bit like trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, or as we're showing it here, a cube peg into a triangular hole. It just doesn't work. Instead, when the pandemic ends, we know that most organizations are going to be moving to a third environment. They're going to be moving to a hybrid environment. In fact, 99% of the HR leaders that we've spoken with expect some form of hybrid work for their organizations, with around 40% expecting the majority of their workforce will have some kind of hybrid work option. What this means is that we need to find a new way of going forward. We can't go back to that burnout and fatigue, those inequities that we saw early on in the pandemic. In order to do that, I'd like you all to stop again and think for a moment. If tomorrow were the first day of work and you forgot everything you'd ever known before about working in an office or working at home, how would you design it? Just take 1 minute and think about that. You can start from day one. What would you do differently? And this is what we asked the HR leaders and the employees that we spoke with. And what we found is that the most progressive organizations that we've worked with are actually moving from what we have on the left side, our old office-centric work design, to a new human-centric design on the right that actually puts the person, not the office, at the center of that design. Now, what this looks like is that we're moving from, instead of focusing on consistent work experiences, we're moving to flexible work experiences in order to drive equality of opportunity instead of pure equality of experiences. Instead of focusing on serendipity as the way to drive positive collaboration that leads to innovation, a human-centric work design enables intentional collaboration, so innovation by design. And finally, instead of helping managers drive visibility-based management, which is really focused on inputs, organizations in a human-centric design help their managers develop empathy, lead with empathy in order to manage to stronger outputs, even though those inputs are going to look different for different individuals. Now, the really good news is that this new human-centric work design actually drives talent and business outcomes in a really powerful way. Compared to an office-centric design for hybrid or remote knowledge workers, a human-centric design decreases fatigue by 44 percentage points. It increases intent to stay by 45 percentage points. Incredibly important right now during this current talent shortage and talent churn. And it also increases performance by 28 percentage points. So for the hybrid future, embracing a human-centric work design based on the attributes you see on the right side gets you less burnout, more retention, better performance. Finally, before I hand things over to Greg, I wanted to spend one moment talking about collaboration, because collaboration is actually one of the biggest sticking points when I'm in a conversation with an HR leader or when they're telling me about what their CEO is saying. And they say it's the reason why they most often say they cannot go to a hybrid work model or why they cannot embrace remote work. They say that to collaborate effectively, teams just have to be together. I don't know if some of you all saw the article recently from Adam Grant, but it's about the joy that we experience, the effervescence that we experience when we're all together in a place, figuring something out together. And there is certainly a time and place for that. There is something magical about working together on the upper left quadrant of what we see here. But what we realized is that working together and working at the same time, so working synchronously, is not the only piece of collaboration that is important for driving innovation. In fact, I was shocked about this. We actually found that a balance of synchronous and asynchronous work is most important for driving innovation. And that asynchronous work, so contributing to collaboration on your own and on your own time and by yourself, is actually just as important as synchronous work. So for it to all work, they both need to happen together. Now, again, as we get back to that question about equity and how we can drive more equitable experiences for the hybrid world, I think this is where rethinking how we collaborate with one another is one of the key points for us moving forward. Because if you think about it, being able to work asynchronously helps those members of a team who may live in different time zones. It also helps those members of the team who are caring for parents or other family members, who are caring for children who need to get work done outside of the typical 9 to 5. Working together, even working alone together, as you see in the upper right quadrant, is better for newer to the workforce employees. And for introverts, we know that that lower right hand of asynchronous work is especially important for driving their innovation. So, as we look at what we found, we know that our environment has changed. It feels like a major shift for me to ask everyone here to rethink how they design work, but think back to the giant shifts that we've faced so far in our environment. We haven't had any incremental change. It's been huge. And so this is our opportunity and actually our responsibility to rethink our work design at a magnitude of the same level of that change in our environment. And by doing so, we can also get better business outcomes for our organizations and better talent and equality outcomes for our employees. So I'm excited to share the conversation now with Greg, who I know has done a lot of work in thinking on these issues and can give some real world examples of how this is playing out.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. And, I sit here reflecting and in the basement of my home, and my wife had just come home. I told her that I had this presentation, and she is just going back to work for a half day. So she's working her second half a day remotely. So it's always, I love your comments around the human-centric work design and around empathy. I think it's so important that we look at our worlds as being a bit different, and there's a fit for everyone, and knowing that not everybody is like me is so important. So I'm going to take a bit of a different spin on this. It's all the same work, but my work really focuses around identifying talent and the challenges that we've had in attracting talent to our organization, many other organizations across the country, and how we fit into the unique environments we have here at CVS Health. So anyhow, my name is Greg Schmidt. I'm the Director of Workforce Initiatives for CVS Health, and myself and my team support CVS Pharmacy, Caremark, MinuteClinic, Specialty, and Aetna. So we have a pretty large reach on many different types of business, both retail and healthcare, pharmacy-based businesses. And so in that case, we have many different needs across the country. I've been with CVS for 26 years. I started as a shift supervisor at CVS, working overnights, and moved into a store manager position and then into workforce development. So I've been on site. I've worked in more of a corporate location, and now this is my permanent home. I mean, it's working remotely, and uniquely, this just happened right before COVID. So it's been an interesting transition to work from home, but I'm excited that we can get out into the field a bit more now and meet up with some folks. So I, along with 50 of my workforce initiatives colleagues, build innovative partnerships that support CVS Health and many communities across the country to drive opportunities for growing and ever-changing workforce. Today, I want to share a little bit on how we build creative solutions as an organization that support a hybrid approach to our workforce needs. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So our purpose really is under these three pillars of building non-traditional talent pipelines, breaking the cycle of poverty, and unlocking individuals' full potential. This is in whole breaking down barriers that individuals have to finding careers and opportunities within our organization. So we're pretty creative with how we do this, and some of the examples would be our apprenticeship program, work experience and explorations, participating with our local, states, and federal government on national certifications, and building unique training sites that have innovation labs inside of them that help folks prepare for careers at CVS Health. You know, I think that the sandwich generation is one that's really impacted by, you know, the COVID outbreak here, and I sure am, you know, caring for adult children and parents, and I actually have two of my in-laws came down with COVID, and it's been challenging. So uniquely, flexibility became so important, and you know, I see myself having it fairly easy, and where so many others don't have the flexibility within their career. So things like transportation, childcare, healthcare, these are all barriers to employment. And so we take an active role in trying to break down those unique barriers as well in connecting folks to careers at CVS Health. We've been doing this work since 1993, so this is not new to us. Like everyone, it's an evolution, but we started with former President Clinton establishing the first public-private government corporate one-stop in the country. And then with President Bush awarded a $1.7 million healthcare apprenticeship program that we piloted in Detroit and then replicated in many other markets across the country. President Obama recognized us in 2015 at the State of the Union And continuing on with President Trump, we've committed to bringing on 5,000 additional apprentices by 2022, and we've already met that goal. So we're super excited about that work. So building talent pipelines is really at the heart of what we do, and building unique training programs and experiences like externships and pre-apprenticeships and pharmacy tech training, and the list goes on and on. Well, we did all of that in person. It was very rare that we did stuff virtually like this. And then we ended up moving to this remote world. So not only was it challenging for us to bring training, which we did, we went 100% remote with our training, but it was also challenging for our candidates who didn't have the access they needed, the technology. So we found ourselves working to figure out how we break down these barriers. You know, the 4 focus areas that we have are working with individuals with disabilities, mature workers, youth, and veterans. And, you know, there were quite significant challenges. And a lot of our work it's very difficult to do remotely. On top of all this, we needed to hire thousands and thousands of new employees for our exploding pharmacy tech needs and also for COVID vaccinations. So we found ourselves getting very creative very quickly. So how we measure success. We've helped tens of thousands of people in underserved communities across meaningful employment opportunities through over 1,400 local and state and federal workforce and community-based partners, while also collaborating with STEM programs as well as colleges and universities. Through our work, we have generated over 12,000 registered apprenticeships across 22 states. Within CVS Health, transitioned over 120,000 individuals from public assistance to careers over the past 20 years, and additionally have hired over 50,000 youth over the past 7 years. After new diverse talent arrives at CVS Health, we continue to provide these programs along with our education and training offerings. This, combined with personal ambition, powers each individual for professional growth. And I can't stress that enough, in the career path opportunities that are available to continue on. And we do all that we can with our partners to offer an endless amount of opportunity. And again, breaking down the barriers of cost and access. I'm super excited to talk about this, our workforce innovation and talent centers. They are just reopening. We currently have locations in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, DC, Cleveland, and our newest is opening next week in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So these are centralized training locations, which we, again, are quickly adapting. And we will be offering both remote training as well as in-person training. We have mock settings at all these locations that show our pharmacies and work. And also we do things like logistics and call center training at these sites as well. And finally, around the strategic diversity management, our objectives here showcase the enterprise commitment to diversity. Social justice and equity framework shows our additional commitment to address inequities faced by Black, African American, and other disenfranchised communities. The objectives and SJ&E framework work together to ensure no community is left behind. So workforce initiatives is a big part of that. And over the past year, we've doubled our workforce to over 50 individuals that span the country to build relationships and programs in our communities in need. And so that's a snapshot of our work at CVS Health. And I will send it over to Heather.
Thanks so much, Greg and Caroline. I've been several times during your presentations, I've wanted to like come off mute and say, really, that's so interesting. I mean, Caroline, 99% of HR managers expect to have some kind of hybrid, remote hybrid work arrangements. That's fascinating. Is that across industries?
Yeah, it's across industries. And again, that can mean several things. That can mean that the executive team has part of the people remote. It can mean that all the knowledge workers who can work remote are remote. It is a big mix. And we realize then that also does bring inequity into the conversation. It means that there are people who are able to have choice over what they do and where they do it and when, and there are people who aren't. And so that's one of the next things that we are really looking into is how do we make sure that as we believe that organizations are going to be going into this world where at least some percentage of the employees are working in a hybrid way, how do we make sure that is fair both to those who go remote and to those who come into the office or into the site? But yeah, that 99% number really shocked us as well.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how we're moving into this very brave new world. I want to encourage everyone to put your questions in the chat. My colleague Ashley Powdar, who's on with us, will help bring those questions to us. Also, I'm really interested if you feel like sharing, put in the chat how much your organizations are thinking about coming back to the office. AARP, for example, we're all going back full time to the office on the 7th of September. And so there's a lot of discussion about that among all of us here at AARP. But then other companies are saying, no, 100% remote. And then most companies are saying a mix. So definitely put that in the chat. We'd really, really like to hear what your organizations are thinking of doing. But Greg, I'm really interested in, what was it like to have all of a sudden have everyone who wasn't a retail store, pharmacy tech, or like an in-person worker, a frontline worker? What was it like to have all of them suddenly abandoned in some ways by like all of the rest of you, like corporate folks? Was there any, what bubbled up from employees? Was there, distress? Was there jealousy that some people got to be remote? What was that like?
Yeah, it's a mix of all of that. So, first and foremost, we recognized our folks on the front lines in our retail locations as healthcare heroes. They have really been a major part in the solution around COVID, and recognizing that and making sure that those individuals were compensated for that role that they played, as well as understanding that things like care of family members, childcare, and other areas quickly challenged our workforce, and so we had to push in some new benefits to really enhance and help out our workforce so they could be there in person. The folks remotely equally have been monumental. I kudos to the folks who drive all the technology, because we moved hundreds and thousands of individuals remotely. I'm about to go out to Pittsburgh, and we have a call center out there that holds about 1,500 call center workers, and they all working at home right now. And again, with our business, it's constantly expanding, and so we have a whole workforce that doesn't even know what it's like to work in an office. So that's our next challenge is some folks are like, yeah, this is great. I like doing this, and now we're asking them to slowly start coming back into the work environment. But I am amazed every day, a big organization like CVS Health, and how fast we were able to move and to make these changes. So overall, I think that we have done a decent job, but with all of that, there is always growing pains. And I think that empathy piece, again, is so important that everybody's situation is a bit different.
And what, can you just give us an example of some extra benefits you added to support caregivers or in other aspects of the workers' lives?
Sure. We offered hero pay is one. So we offered bonuses for individuals and increase in pay for our frontline workers in our retail pharmacies. We also offered childcare for, I believe it was close to 2 to 3 months worth of childcare through a unique organization partner, and they gave options to use this organization for that childcare, or to select your own individual to take care of your child or your parent in need. So and again, it was a necessity. So that's a few. On the other side of the business, our call centers, we obviously had to install tons of technology into individuals' homes and landlines and things like that. So accommodating that and flexible work environments were also super important. So many of those jobs were full-time. We had to go make part-time selections and really work around our teammates' needs.
Right. Caroline, I wanted to come back to something that you covered that I thought was really interesting and that had never occurred to me before. So we do hear a lot about this this bias towards being collaboration in person, and that's what sparks innovation. And certainly that effervescence that you mentioned in that article is true. I miss that. That's something that I'm really looking forward to getting back is meetings. I'm not looking forward to mornings because of the rush with kids and backpacks and all this stuff, but I'm really looking forward to meeting with people again in person. However, there are also periods that when you're alone, when you're working alone asynchronously, you have the opportunity for deep reflection, and that's also needed to drive innovation. I wonder if you have any insights in your data about that, or your conversations with HR folks.
Absolutely. This is one of, I think, the most important parts of the whole hybrid remote in office conversation. And the way I like to think about it is that when we work together, we're actually like a band. We're like a band of musicians. And when you think of a band writing music, sometimes you need to get together and you need to jam, and you need to try things out together, and you need to see how it's going to sound. And you get a little goofy sometimes, or you try something wild, or one person is a diva and shows off. And you do that, and you have some of that creative tension together. Sometimes you need to go off by yourself and you need to write down your lyrics. You need to test them. Maybe you need to test them with someone outside the band. And sometimes you need to go for a long walk all alone and actually not talk to anybody about it and just hum to yourself. And so I think that's the way that it's been helpful for me and my team to really think about. We used to think that collaboration could only look one way. And I think now what we're finding is that collaboration has more ingredients than we maybe thought before. And so as we're looking for what's next, we just need to ask ourselves for each meeting, for each instance, not just, does this need to be a meeting? Could it have been an email? But what is going to be the most valuable way to collaborate for this? One piece that you alluded to, though, that I think is really important to keep in mind is that we have seen that there is a really powerful bias from managers towards people in the office. So if a manager is in the office, they actually are more likely to believe that the people in the office are more likely to be high performers and more likely to be deserving of promotion than those outside of the office. This is particularly strange and jarring because before the pandemic, many of the people who were remote workers because they had earned the privilege to do that. So they were already high performers, they had proved themselves, and now they're getting penalized because of their choice to be remote and because of that privilege that they had earned to go remote. And so again, as we think through this, and I've seen a question in the chat around meetings, I think one of the key issues is awareness and making sure that managers are aware in meetings in particular how they can get everyone in the room to speak up. And that might mean using different meeting formats across a year or across a quarter. It might mean that even if you are all in the office together, everyone has their screen on and everyone has their phones down, just so that there is some level of uniformity and openness to those who are not physically in the room.
Yeah, I remember attending a really interesting session on the different seeds of bias, and there's different sources of bias. One of them is proximity. Like, in other words, like, what it's like if you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, I know someone who went to that school, or my mom used to live there. And you immediately feel a connection that is just based on that proximity, which really doesn't have anything, might not have anything to do with, giving you that connection. But we do have that bias, and I think I've also heard of plans to have remote first. In other words, like if you're having a meeting with half people in the office, half people remote, that you let the remote folks speak first. You hand it over to them first, so that you're constantly pulling them back in as a presence, even though they're not physically there. And Greg, you'd mentioned that you had to move all your training online. So we're talking about collaboration for innovation, but also, previously training was all handled in person. How did you do that? How did you, recreate that online for all your folks?
Yeah, it's been very unique. Just like we are right now, and mostly, using platforms like Zoom and WebEx and other areas. In fact, we were talking earlier that this is somewhat a different platform that I don't normally use, and some others don't as well. Where I know that younger generations use this often, and they're like, oh, I don't understand the WebEx piece, and so I think that was part of the challenge. Another piece of the challenge was for us, it was really the content change. So we had to rewrite content and think of unique ways to deliver content. And that was very challenging as well. I think of our farm tech training, and really so much of that you need to be within the workstations of our pharmacy, and it's challenging to do that training. So really you're doing all the book training and learning online, and then you are forced into a store and off you go. And so, it's been an evolution, and it still continues to evolve. That's really exciting. The other piece for us uniquely is interviewing. So this is a very stressful way to do an interview online like this. And in many cases, you're kind of doing a pre-interview without a person there. So the question comes up on your screen and you answer it. So now what we do is we're doing more video interviews. So we're preparing individuals on how to do that, and how to communicate well over video, and your lighting, you making sure your sound is right, and that you have some practice in that area. So, but it's a total different culture shift, and I don't think that is all going away. I think some of that may stick. I just brought somebody on in New Jersey. Normally I would drive down to New Jersey to interview them. Now it's like, well, this may be a bit more effective and cost effective, time effective to do it this way. So I think that it will create some positive and negative as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think, Caroline, of this balance that you're saying companies are trying to achieve, because one of the things I wonder about is, will there be a privileging of in-person meetings, and how do we make sure not to not to cut off opportunity for people who do in fact stay completely remote. And I don't know if what you're hearing from the employer community on that.
Yeah, and that's similar to a question that we've gotten in the chat around really sort of what kinds of mindset shifts management and managers at all levels need to take in order to make sure that there isn't a bias or that there isn't a privileging. You mentioned, Heather, one way to do this, which would be having that remote first policy. We're also seeing sort of day-by-day steps that organizations can take, where they are making sure that there's always a room monitor, so that there's always an in-office room monitor, and then also a virtual room monitor to make sure that every voice is heard in a meeting. I think it goes beyond that, though. I think that as we see organizations looking to counter bias in all instances, awareness of that bias is one important step, but then also building in processes and holding leaders truly accountable for change on it is another step. So as organizations look at what are their KPIs, what are their goals for the leaders in their organizations, building a sense of inclusion, particularly across remote teams and hybrid teams, needs to be an important part of how they're managing success for the year.
Yeah, and to that, I would also add curiosity, because I think, one of the most important things that managers can do is not assume. Don't assume is a big mantra that I always talk about with employers with regard to older workers. For example, don't assume that they will automatically only want the higher salary if they're going for a more junior position. Maybe they're trying to recareer or reskill. And then the same would go for people who, are remote or have caretaker issues or whatever, to just be curious. I think that's a mindset that the managers can adopt. Ashley, I want to turn it over to you and see if we have some other questions in the chat that for Caroline or Greg or the rest of us.
Great discussion, guys. We're getting a lot of great questions, and if you haven't already, please just drop that into the Q&A. I do want to just touch base briefly on disabilities. Jerry has asked, I well know that people with disabilities struggled with work from home pre-pandemic. Caroline or Greg, if employees with disabilities are included in the hybrid ways of working, can you elaborate on that? We would love to hear what Greg from CVS is doing with their employees with disabilities and their ways of working during the pandemic and future plans post-pandemic. Let's start with that one.
Yeah, thanks. A great question. And we've always have been working with the disability community and have relationships across the country. We are working with our ability here in New York State, and one of our initiatives we're working to build is a somewhat, I call it a Siri or a bot that will help individuals and prompt them through the interview process. In so many cases, job developers are gone and they have been temporarily laid off. So it's been a real challenge for individuals with disabilities to get the services that they need to be successful. So we've innovated with this organization to build this tool that will kind of walk you through and ask you unique questions that will in turn build you a resume and match you to jobs. So that has been a big win. The other thing is that some of this remote work has also been a big win especially for individuals who have mobility challenges. So working from home is an option that wasn't always there before. So I think that has been a positive. The navigating technology has been a challenge across, and we've been doing lots of things around that as well, and looking at new technology to work with individuals. But I think it's so important in so many cases to have that in-person interaction and to be able to practice your work within stores and within other facilities. I'm a very hands-on person as well, and you can only go so far with the remote training.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like what you're saying is employers need to have tools that support all abilities. So thank you. There's two questions I want to get to, Caroline. I don't know if you had any comments, but I do want to touch on two more from the chat before our time is up in 10 minutes.
That's great. Everything that Greg said is spot on. And I'm excited about the approach that you all are taking.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have a question from Trisha regarding caregivers. How important is it for employers to offer equitable benefits and flexibility to all caregivers in your organization? For example, parents who take care of their children, as well as people who take care of aging loved ones or adults with needs.
One piece that I can talk to here, and then I'll pass it over to Greg to understand the CVS approach, is that we saw so many organizations across the pandemic begin to think about caregiving in a broader sense than they had before. And so at first, the conversation was with what was sort of thrust right in front of all of us, right? It was our kids on our laps during Zoom calls, day in, day out. So organizations saw that that was something that they needed to address to help their employees be productive. Then there were employees who had in many cases been caregivers for adults or adult children for years, but hadn't necessarily gotten the support. But now suddenly, because cameras are in homes and we're having conversations there, more of that whole person and all of the needs that an employee has are suddenly visible to their managers and teams. And suddenly things that had existed before were obvious. So this was actually a really interesting occasion to bring to light some of the needs that employees had that weren't discussed. So what we've seen is a lot more conversations around different kinds of caregiving benefits. The other side of this, though, is that employees who are not caregivers, in some instances, have been frustrated or felt that they are being discriminated against or treated unfairly because their colleagues who are caregivers are getting benefits that they are then not entitled to. So all in all, this is forcing organizations to look really carefully at what employees need. And the most progressive organizations we're working with are having a lot of these conversations at the team level, at the employee level, to really understand what are the flexibility needs of each employee, and enabling actually employees to start those conversations with their managers. So that if an employee needs a certain accommodation for a disability or to take care of a family member, that's one conversation. But if an employee is feeling burnt out and needs to take some time out just for themselves, that's another kind of conversation about another kind of accommodation. So it's all now coming to light much more than what we had seen before.
Great, thank you. Greg, do you have any further comments?
And Caroline, again, spot on, and leading the mature worker talent pipeline group. This is actually work in progress for us. We found that the flexibility of our different jobs was limited. We're full-time, we're part-time, we're but there was no room for changing that. So let's say hey, I'm on the verge of retirement, but I really don't want to move into retirement yet. I prefer to go into a part-time role or at least a limited hours or flexible work environment. We don't have job codes to fit all of those needs. We definitely have options, but like for my role, there's not a part-time equivalent. And what we found is that when people do transition into other roles, that they're losing a lot of unique benefits with that. So we are working to level set that, and because we need the talent, we need to retain this talent. And so we have a lot of great things in work, but we still have a lot of work to do around that piece. But it's definitely opened eyes on the need to look at options.
Fantastic. It sounds like self-care as well as caring for others is equally as important and should not be a biased conversation. Okay, so we have a question from Nikki. This is more around the managerial will to build a more equitable environment. So what is your organization's experience overtaxing those who come into the office simply for ease of proximity and access? How do you encourage leaders to tap into the skill, time, and experience across the team in the office and work from home when it can be easier to tap into those right in front of them physically?
What a great question. And one of the words in here that I think is really important in solving this question is that word skill. And what we're seeing organizations do to tackle this, and really all sorts of problems organizations are facing now, is breaking roles and jobs down into skills. To think about what are the skills that are actually needed to solve this part of the problem. And it may not be a full role that is needed to solve a problem. It may be a set of skills. And those skills, one person may have some of those skills, another person may have another set of them. So Greg, to your point about looking now at roles a little bit more flexibly and thinking, okay, could this individual be a part-time role? That's then an occasion to think about their skills and to think about what are the skills that we want them to bring to the table, and then what are skills that they have that we can maybe cut out of their day-to-day and what we need them to do, and look for that somewhere else. So to Nikki's question in the chat, I think it's important not only, again, to be aware of that bias, again, for that conversation between employees and managers to make sure that they are having that transparency around what employees are being asked to do and who managers are going to, holding them to those responsibilities. But then also really thinking critically about who actually has the skill to do this task and where are they? Often they're not going to be the ones right in front of the manager.
Great, thank you. Greg, any other thoughts? Heather?
I think it comes down to, for supply and demand as well. You know, we have to be flexible. I see so many industries, you know, folks looking for one or the other and making the move to, you know, a flexible work environment, or some want to be back in the office, you know, so I think that the awareness of this is so important, and making those accommodations and being flexible in this type of environment is really important to retain talent.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about this, Greg, and I'm just going to have, we'll pull this in as the last one, Ashley. Since you've invested so much in this infrastructure to put in people's homes and in the, you know, in the switch to online training and everything, but then we're coming back to a lot of us are coming back into offices. If we think about the Delta variant, Stephanie brought this up in the Q&A, how are companies preparing for the possibility that the Delta variant will sort of upend the apple cart? And it seems to me like with all this investment that you've made, you could keep those investments in place and sort of pivot back if needed. And I don't know if you guys have thought about that.
I can't speak for the organization in whole around this, but I will say, you know, there's quite the cost in real estate, and you know, right now, in some of our call centers, we can't accommodate all the people we've hired back in our states. So you know, it does make good business sense. I don't see all of these remote roles going away. And I like I'm working at home. It's for some it's a permanent solution. So I think there'll be a little bit of a mix, but I think you can make a business case for keeping some of this in place.
Right. Great. Well, we are basically at the top of the hour. I want to thank you, Caroline and Greg, for your fantastic insights on this topic. I wanted to just close with a little bit of insight around sort of the multi-generational piece of this. And one of the things that was interesting to me that was found across a whole bunch of different surveys, including PwC and Pew and a couple others, that older workers had an easier time during the pandemic transitioning to this remote environment. That could possibly be because, you know, they don't have kids at home that they're juggling all this back and forth. But it also could be that there's just this wealth of experience they have in having weathered things before. And so I think as we start to contemplate returning to the office, it's really helpful for either people who are brand new to the workforce, to your workforce, or who are younger and really do benefit from the presence of sort of in-person mentoring with your older colleagues. I think that's something to think about. And if there's a way to enable that over Zoom, if someone is totally remote, it's something to pay attention to and remember, because we do tend to benefit from those in-person connections, even as we benefit from the flexibility of remote. But again, thank you both so much. I've learned a ton. I would love to keep asking questions, but that's all we have time for today. Anyone who wants to get in touch with me, just feel free to email me with questions. I'll get you an answer back. And with that, I'll close and say, have a great rest of your day. Thank you again so much. Take care, everybody, and be safe.